Sang Yul Hun lived a life of needles, experiments, and medicines. He was subjected to a series of treatments that were supposed to turn him into an Omega, but he never did. Despite that, he became Omega-like, catching the attention of the infamous Alpha Prince Ryak Lee. Caught up in a dance of politics, greed, and ambitions, how will the prince unveil the secrets of this Omega-like Sang Yul, and will Sang Yul escape the life of the lab rat, the only one he ever knew how to live? The sun shines in the room, waking Sang Yul up. He takes time to observe the room he's in and realizes he is in the prince's chambers. After the shower, he must have spent the night in the prince's room as he can still smell the lingering scent of the man. That assures Sang Yul that last night was indeed real. While he tries to go up from the bed, Sang Yul clutches his back as he feels pain, perhaps caused by his intimate night with the prince. However, before Sang Yul can leave the bed, he hears the room's sliding doors open. Sang Yul slightly flinches away as he sees Jung appear before him with a stern look on his face. Sang Yul greets Jung, and Jung returns the greeting as he closes the door. Jung looks away from Sang Yul as he announces that it is almost noontime. Sang Yul apologizes for being tardy, but Jung clarifies that the prince has told them to let him rest. Sang Yul becomes silent at Jung's seemingly cold treatment, thinking that Jung must have been mad that he slept in. Sang Yul asks Jung where the prince is, and Jung answers that he represents the royal family at an event. Jung also points out that Sang Yul is the reason Jung wasn't with the prince at the event itself. Jung then calls Sang Yul by his real full name, making Sang Yul think that everyone must already know about him. Jung proceeds to leave a few reminders for Sang Yul. Firstly, Sang Yul is not allowed to leave the room without permission. When he needs to leave the chamber, he needs permission from Butler Kim. Jung also tells him about the investigation the Prince and Guanhe Institute are conducting, where they will need Sang Yul's help. He mentions that Prince Ryak will tell him the rest of the details once he's back, so Sang Yul should brace himself. Sang Yul meekly agrees as he thinks back to Guanhe Institute, a known medical institution that handles national health care. He knows that Jiudong Pharma and Guanhe Institute stand at odds against each other, and he wonders how he might help Guanhe Institute. Jung also informs Sang Yul that members of the royal family write a journal called the Quotidian Records. These records recount the emotions and the events of each day of a royal family member. Traditionally, an advisor of a royal family member writes it on their behalf. However, Prince Ryak has been writing his records himself ever since. Knowing his place, Prince Ryak tries to fulfill his responsibilities perfectly while being kind to everyone around him. The point of Jung telling Sang Yul about this is to show that the prince tends to be unnecessarily kind to everyone. Therefore, his behavior towards Sang Yul mustn't be completely misunderstood. I understand Jung's point as the prince's most trusted servant, although as an omniscient reader, Jung might sound very unreasonable and perhaps mean. Cut the man some slack, he's been through a lot and will go through a lot with our couple. Jung points out that Sang Yul shouldn't wish to become a consort, making sure that Sang Yul didn't confess everything to Prince Ryak for that goal. Jung is suspicious of Sang Yul's timing, that a secret completely hidden away from the prince is simply revealed in a single night. Sang Yul can only muster a few words before Jung interjects and asks him if he wants to use Prince Ryak to take revenge against Jiudong Pharma. Sang Yul vehemently denies the accusation, which Jung is happy to hear about. Jung also lets him know that the people who know his secret, even Prince Ryak, are also wary of Sang Yul. They believe this might be part of Sang Yul's scheme that they don't know about. Sang Yul denies the existence of such a plan, thinking that he never even thought of becoming part of Yueyang Hall, the prince's hall. Sang Yul helplessly asks Jung how he can prove himself to them. Jung then simply tells Sang Yul to reveal everything to Prince Ryak, from his fake identity of Chulsu Kim to the secrets of Jiudong Pharma. When Jung sees Sang Yul fall silent, he also makes him understand that they cannot blindly trust anyone at this point. He isn't trying to attack Sang Yul, but rather he prioritizes the safety of the prince. Sang Yul understands where Jung is coming from and can only try to apologize. Jung then tells Sang Yul that they will be going to the annex. When Sang Yul is left alone, he ponders upon Jung's words. He knows that he isn't trustworthy to Jung after revealing his lies. He also realizes that Courtier Shin and Butler Kim must already know about his real identity. This would also mean that Mr. Han already knows about it. Sang Yul is overwhelmed with fear. He wants to help, but he's afraid of what Mr. Hun might do to the prince. Mr. Hun once told him that no one would believe him because he was simply a nobody with no name to himself. He realizes that he has to prove his innocence and explain everything to Prince Ryak. Our soft boy grown the guts to go against Mr. Hun. Truly the peak of character development. Song Yul then recalls the prince's sweet smile whenever he reassured him that he was always there for Song Yul. As Song Yul steals his resolve to reveal everything, his thoughts are cut off by a loud knock on the door. From the other side of the door, Prince Ryeok asks for permission to enter the room. Song Yul realizes what he has to do now and invites the prince in. Prince Ryeok asks for permission to enter Song Yul's room. Song Yul lets him in and the prince is surprised to see him awake. Song Yul explains that he just recently woke up and also didn't expect the prince to visit him so early. The prince tells him that he has a gift for him. The prince puts away what seems to be food from the kitchen of Yeonhwa Palace by the side and sits on Song Yul's bed. Song Yul notices Prince Ryeok's exhaustion and sits beside him. Prince Ryeok confirms that he is indeed tired since he just got reprimanded for what he said at the event today. He initially wanted to just walk around, but he ended up going to Song Yul's room since he was thinking of him all day. Song Yul blushes at the prince's comment as Prince Ryeok notices that Song Yul seems tired himself. He asks if Song Yul was able to get enough rest and Song Yul explains that he is fine, having rested well because of the prince. The prince fondly looks at Song Yul shyly looking down and caresses the younger man's head, earning a mild blush on the latter's face. Song Yul remembers that the prince had something to say to him so he needs to be less bashful and get serious. Song Yul then points out that Jung told him they would be talking about something. The prince's face darkens at the mention of it, which Song Yul notices. The prince tries to beat around the bush as he doesn't know how to relay the information properly to Song Yul. He eventually tells Song Yul that people from Jodong Pharma are visiting the prince soon. Song Yul's eyes widen in surprise. Realizing what this might mean, Song Yul stutters as he finally understands what Jung means when he says to prepare himself. Prince Ryeok looks at Song Yul's hands, folding upon each other, as he also lets him know that Mr. Hun should already know that Song Yul is in the prince's annex, thanks to his spy in the palace. That's why he asked for an audience with the prince to find out how things were going. However, their talk should tackle the fake Song Yul Hun first, so the real Song Yul shouldn't be involved for now. However, the prince drops to Song Yul's feet as he holds them dearly. He explains to Song Yul that for their talk to favor the prince, Prince Ryeok needs Song Yul's help. He has a few questions he wants to ask Song Yul, such as his Omega-like constitution and the real identity of the fake Song Yul. Prince Ryeok asks Song Yul if he can at least answer those two questions. From the depths of Song Yul's memories in the lab, a voice warns Song Yul from telling anyone about his life at the lab. Hun Seok, the fake Song Yul's words from when Song Yul injured him echo again, asking if being friends with the prince made Song Yul uncooperative. Finally, Jung's words from earlier rang in his head, that the prince is simply being kind to him and that Prince Ryeok might not harbor special feelings for him. Song Yul's entire body shakes as he apologizes to the prince. As much as he wants to tell the prince about everything he has gone through in Jodong Pharma, he has to go against how he has lived his life until then to be able to tell the prince everything. A tear falls at the prince's hand as he comforts Song Yul. I would have hugged Song Yul right there and then. He instead changes his question to that of assurance that Song Yul will eventually tell him everything, even if he can't talk about it now. Song Yul's tear-stricken eyes pool more tears as he recalls the horrible things that happened to him back at Jodong Pharma. Since a young age, he has been lying down in a hospital bed, with researchers observing his body's reactions to several medications and injections. A certain memory about a researcher insisting on testing another injection plays in Song Yul's mind. Another researcher warned that Song Yul would lose consciousness if they continued. The glare of surgical lights paired with the last words of the researcher about doing something to prevent that from happening ends the memory. Song Yul thinks that when the prince realizes what has become of his body after his time at Jodong Pharma, he might look at him differently. However, he looks at the prince's face, full of resolve to help him, and he also gains the resolve to help the prince despite such a risk. Stuttering, Song Yul explains that he will tell the prince everything eventually, but it might be a while before he can tell him all that he knows. The prince runs his fingers across Song Yul's face, wiping away his tears and thanking him for his bravery. The communication between these two is unparalleled. Even in real-life, couples can barely match how well these characters communicate their feelings and thoughts toward each other. Prince Ryeok sweetly looks at Song Yul as he asks Song Yul to get tested at Gwanghae Institute. However, Song Yul explains that he knows Gwanghae Institute will not be able to find anything on his body, despite whatever test they would give him. Although he meekly adds that it might just be his opinion, Song Yul doesn't want the prince to spend unnecessary effort on him. Surprised, the prince reaffirms with Song Yul that he never went to school or had a drink or a late-night snack before meeting the prince. Prince Ryeok is somber at the fact that someone who hasn't experienced the world normally has such familiarity with complex medical tests. Song-yul wants to apologize, but the prince stops him. Song-yul realizes that he shouldn't have said anything about the tests. Prince Ryeok then assures him that although Song-yul might have gone through routine tests back at Jodong Pharma, there might be stuff they missed because of their fixation on unique traits. General medicine professionals, such as the ones at Gwanghae Institute, might be able to find something different since they won't be focused on unique traits. Song-yul looks at the prince, who continues to explain the benefits of getting tested at Gwanghae Institute, and realizes that the prince is worried about him. He also notices that the prince tries to avoid overwhelming him with heavy questions. With just those two questions, the prince would understand how he lived his life back at Jodong Pharma. Those questions would allow the prince to understand what Jodong Pharma did, as well as help Song-yul in the process, hitting two birds with one stone. Song-yul laughs at his realization, and Prince Ryeok is surprised at the sudden laughter. The prince seemingly tries to scare Song-yul about laughing while crying, but he chooses to pinch Song-yul's face instead. He finally stands up and reassures Song-yul not to worry about Jodong Pharma's visit. He encourages Song-yul to rest and do some homework if he's bored. Song-yul remembers that Mr. Hun will be coming soon, that he has stopped shaking in fear. He fondly looks at his hands as he realizes how much Prince Ryeok has calmed him down. As if hit by a large pang of inspiration and courage, Song-yul suddenly thinks of coming to the meeting with Mr. Hun and the prince. He inadvertently pulls on the prince's robes and immediately tries to apologize for it. However, the prince knows that Song-yul has something to say to him. Albeit hesitantly, Song-yul proposes to join the prince in his meeting with Mr. Hun. Prince Ryeok's eyes widen in shock as Song-yul requests to join his meeting with Mr. Hun. After a short pause, the prince reminds Song-yul that Mr. Hun will be there with him, making Song-yul flinch a bit. Song-yul fiddles with his fingers as he points out that as thanks for the prince not putting him back in Yuyeong Hall, and although he might just end up frozen in silence during a meeting, he might gain the courage to tell the prince everything if Song-yul sees Mr. Hun face to face. As if deliberating the decision, the prince falls into silence. Song-yul takes this as a refusal and apologizes for the ridiculous request. However, the prince suddenly agrees, taking Song-yul aback, under the condition that Mr. Hun must put in the request to see him first. Bringing Song-yul into the meeting unannounced might be seen as a provocation that could backfire on the prince. The prince also points out that even if Song-yul won't be able to see him in this meeting, there will be other times he will be able to. Song-yul didn't think that the prince would readily agree to his idea, thinking that it might be more detrimental than helpful. However, Prince Ryeok is encouraging him to be strong enough to face Mr. Hun. He enjoys the prince's large and comforting hands holding his as the prince prepares to leave and gives him some homework to do. Prince Ryeok goes over some books and points out sections of the books that Song-yul should study. After their conversation, Song-yul feels so much better. He hears tapping from his door and sees the prince goofily smiling as he waves goodbye to him. That is when Song-yul realizes what it feels like to be comforted and surrounded by people who truly love him. The day of the meeting finally comes, and Song-yul's bed is fixed up, as well as his homework. Song-yul trails behind Jung as they walk across a hallway. Wearing only a plain shirt, simple pants, and unassuming shoes, Song-yul's courage from a few days ago seems to have dissipated when the day of the meeting is here. Mr. Hun indeed requested to see him, hence why he is joining the meeting. As per his agreement with the prince, he knows why Mr. Hun wants to see him. Mr. Hun wants to know whether Song-yul was actually able to seduce Prince Ryeok using his Omega-like traits. Mr. Hun would also have a lot to say about his medications and what he would need to do moving forward. Mr. Hun also chose not to meet the prince in Yuyeong Hall. Yuyeong Hall is out of the prince's jurisdiction, so Song-yul and Mr. Hun would be able to secretly meet up there. Before Song-yul can further ruminate on it, Jung suddenly stops in his tracks, making Song-yul bump into Jung's back. Jung asks Song-yul if he is fine, while Song-yul blushes in embarrassment. Jung then informs Song-yul that everything is ready for the meeting, and nothing important will be talked about there. Song-yul just needs to behave properly while he's there. Song-yul isn't sure that he can do that, but Jung reminds him of the etiquette training he got when he first came into the palace. Jung repeats the royal decorum upon entering the room while both of them wait for Butler Kim's signal for Song-yul to go in. Song-yul braces himself as the fact that Mr. Hun is right close to him starts to hammer into reality. Encouraging himself, Butler Kim opens the door to the room and announces Song-yul's entrance, calling him by his fake name, Cholsu Kim. Inside the room, a table separates Prince Ryeok from Mr. Hun and the fake Song-yul. Mr. Hun acknowledges Song Yul with a dark look, making Song Yul flinch. Once again, encouraging himself, Song Yul reminds himself to greet the prince first. Once the prince acknowledges him, he proceeds to take a seat beside the prince. As he walks to his seat, the Jiudong Pharma employees shoot a dark gaze at him. When Song Yul finally finds his way to his seat, he is grateful to not have messed up the first step. However, he glances up at the leering glares of the Jiudong Pharma employees, as well as the fake Song Yul. He immediately looks down to escape their murderous stares. If I was there, I would have been shooting them with equally murderous stares, too. The gall of these people to be angry. Prince Riyok picks up his teacup and explains that he only received Mr. Hun's request for Chulsu to join the meeting rather recently, so Chulsu might be flustered at the sudden summons. Mr. Hun also apologizes for his change of mind. He then turns to Song Yul and mentions that there is a lot they might need to talk about, not having met each other for a while. The first agenda that Mr. Hun wants to tackle is an apology. He suddenly grabs the fake Song Yul's hair and slams his head onto the table. With no warning at all, Mr. Hun slams the fake Song Yul's head onto the table. Mr. Hun's audacity to commit such an aggressive action in front of the prince catches the attention of Zheng and the other palace attendants. Unrelenting, Mr. Hun continues to hit the fake Song Yul's head to the table until they hear a cracking sound. Afraid, Song Yul doesn't understand why Mr. Hun is doing this in front of a lot of people, knowing that it would damage his reputation. Song Yul finally realizes when Mr. Hun has stopped and a puddle of blood pools at the table with the fake Song Yul limply lying down on the table. Unbothered by anyone's shock or the blood on the table, Mr. Hun simply stares at Song Yul menacingly. Song Yul realizes that to Mr. Hun and everyone in Jiudong Pharma, including him, this is a normal occurrence to them. Prince Riyok puts his teacup down and warns Mr. Hun about the kind of place Yeonhwa Palace is. Clearly upset with the violence, he sternly asks for an explanation for the unsightly show. Uncaring about the mood of the room, Mr. Hun explains that he has received news from the Department of National Records that his son has been misbehaving and abusing illegal substances. He tries to excuse his son's behavior by saying that he has spoiled him too much, although he didn't expect him to be like this. He apologizes on behalf of his son to the prince for his improper behavior inside the palace, and he also apologizes for his aggressive action. He feigns concern for the prince by saying that the prince's young age makes him unable to stomach such situations. He then turns his attention to the fake Song Yul, pulling his hair back again and dropping him to the ground. Mr. Hun assures the prince that he will teach a lesson to his son. Mr. Hun tries to end the meeting, but Prince Riyok interjects in by asking how he is going to deal with the aftermath of his son's behavior, since the Department of National Records doesn't seem to want to have anything to do about it. Before Mr. Hun can answer, Prince Riyok interjects again by guessing that Prince Riyok's brother must have asked a favor for all pro-Jiudong Pharma media outlets to keep the news under wraps. Prince Riyok sweetly smiles in obvious sarcasm as he apologizes for being too direct with his question. Still unfazed, Mr. Hun simply smiles in return as he enjoys having these kinds of direct conversations with him, just like when they had the marriage arrangements before. Mr. Hun points out that being a leader and an alpha, Prince Riyok should be direct indeed. The comment makes both the prince and Song Yul flinch. Song Yul knows that Mr. Hun is mocking the prince right now. Mr. Hun then explains that he will deal with his son himself and properly lecture him, so he should be out of the prince's concerns. Meanwhile, Zheng asks the attendant to serve some tea for Mr. Hun. The attendant offers a cup of primrose root tea to Mr. Hun. Mr. Hun is quickly rising the ranks for the most hated character in all of BL. Mr. Hun is surprised at the prince's choice of tea since he expects the prince to have more refined and flavorful tea, as if pointing out the prince's lack of such traits. However, the prince dismisses the comment, saying that he doesn't particularly care about what he drinks. He does point out that Mr. Hun must have such audacity to question the prince's preferences. Prince Riyok also warns Mr. Hun against his treatment of the fake Song Yul Hun as an immature son. The fake Song Yul Hun became one of the prince's people the moment he entered the palace. Song Yul flinches again at the mention of his name, this time less because of fear, but more because of affection. He knows that the prince only mentioned his name to judge how Mr. Hun treated Hun Siyok, but he also feels that the prince is also talking about him, the real Song Yul Hun. With the prince's words, it's as if the prince stands by his decision to keep Song Yul at Yuyang Hall and no one should dare question it. He then stops himself from his delusional train of thoughts. Song Yul is really just like the rest of us, delusional at times. He's got it better, though, since his delusions are actually passable for reality. The prince stands up and postpones his plans of discussing more things with Mr. Hun to another time. Mr. Hun tries to make him stay for lunch, but Prince Riyok looks at the fake Song Yul slightly jerking around on the ground. Disgusted at the sight, the prince orders Jum to call a doctor to treat the fake Song Yul at Yuan Hall. He then turns his attention back to Mr. Hun and speaks about their supposed agenda for the unique trait test kits. Prince Riyok's appearance on the cooking show has garnered a lot of potential sponsors for the kits, and he has hoped that the meeting would let them talk about early shipments of these kits. However, the state of the table and the fake Song Yul don't seem to make for a good atmosphere for such topics. Prince Riyok doesn't know what his brother would think of what transpired in the meeting, but he himself does not condone such violence. He doesn't care if not being able to stomach makes him not alpha enough and leaves the room with hopes of meeting Mr. Hun on more amiable terms. Song Yul is left at the table not knowing what to do next. However, the prince looks back and asks Song Yul if he is not leaving yet since he has a lot to do, referring to him as Cholsu for appearances. Song Yul knows that the prince called him out to give him the prerogative of leaving on his own, even though Song Yul himself asked the prince to let him join the meeting in the first place. He scans the room, looking at the Jiudong Pharma delegation and the bloodied cuffs of Mr. Hun. Song Yul stands from his seat and gains the courage to ask Mr. Hun why he was sent to the palace in the first place. Standing away from the table, Song Yul asks Mr. Hun why he was sent to the palace. The question earns a few chuckles and snickers from the Jiudong Pharma employees who came with Mr. Hun. Feeling embarrassed, Song Yul continues to say that Mr. Hun could have just chosen to leave him back at the lab. Mr. Hun suddenly stops Song Yul by saying that he has heard about the prince favoring Song Yul lately. He was disappointed that Song Yul never turned into a fully fledged Omega, but if that selfish prick of a prince had gotten obsessed with him, the experiments they did on Song Yul were not for naught. Song Yul is ticked off that Mr. Hun called Prince Riyok a selfish prick when he has been nothing but selfless to him. He's willing to be spoken badly, but he won't let Mr. Hun badmouth the prince. Song Yul is about to reprimand him for his choice of words, but Mr. Hun interjects again by confirming his question. Mr. Hun finally answers the question by saying that he feels Song Yul needs to know about the shame of having a body that is unlike anyone's. He knows that Song Yul felt different as soon as he was with other people. As part of their experiment, they need to know the reactions of their lab specimens. A lab rat who shamefully carries out their duties can produce better data than one who simply follows instructions blindly. Mr. Hun then clarifies that his primary role is to fill in as Hun Siyuk, the fake Song Yul's blood tests. Mr. Choi, perhaps one of the researchers, is also interested as to how an Omega-like person like Song Yul would react when exposed to a real alpha, like the prince. They are happy to know that he and the prince spent the night together, which would make their experiment more interesting to people in the future. I am flabbergasted at the dark souls of these people. How do I go to their world and give them a piece of me in my mind? Mr. Hun then prepares to leave as he plans to arrange another meeting with the prince with the Jiudong Pharma employees helping him out. He also mentions that he knows the prince wouldn't think twice about throwing Hun Siyuk aside to marry Song Yul, so Song Yul simply needs to do as he has been doing. The Jiudong Pharma delegation finally leaves, leaving Song Yul alone in the room. Song Yul drops to his knees in despair and tears. He is frustrated to think that it had to be him to go through all of this. He thinks back to his earliest memories. A young Song Yul was in a room sitting with his biological father. The kid asked his dad what they were doing in that place, and the father replied that the child would be staying there from then on. The young boy asked about where his father would be, but the older man did not reply. A formal-looking person came into the room and greeted the father. She then asked the little one about his name, but the father didn't bother to even name the child and instead urged for the woman to give him the money as they had agreed. The young kid did not see the transaction from behind his father's figure, but as soon as it was done, the woman escorted the child away, carried in the arms of an unknown woman while he looked at his father walking away in the opposite direction. The boy's life would change from then on. The boy was brought into a room with Mr. Hun and another man in a business suit, the latter introducing the child as the best specimen, being the child of an Omega. Mr. Hun coldly observed the boy, now dressed in a hospital gown. The child innocently looked at the man until Mr. Hun's face formed a sinister smile as he exclaimed in joy about the child's arrival. He then arranged for everyone to come to Building B. In another memory, a voice was panicking about why the boy was still having seizures. A researcher explained that the boy's body couldn't take the medications and suggested pausing her treatments. The boy continued to tremble and shake on the bed, while Mr. Hun darkly looked at the scene and instructed the researcher to simply tie the boy up. He wanted the researcher to continue the injections and do something just to make it work. Meanwhile, the young boy could only cry as he could only think of the pain permeating throughout his body. The researcher noticed that the boy had fainted, making Mr. Hun disappointed. Mr. Hun instructed the researcher to let him rest for 2 days before continuing their inhumane experiments. Powerless, the researcher had no choice but to agree. Just like how he cried during his younger years while experimenting, the current Song Yul clutches himself on the ground as he cries about his most pitiable state of being. "Oh, my poor, precious baby, it pains me to see you like this." At the palace gardens, Jung is taking a call through his ear mix while Prince Ryeok is casually sitting nearby. He suddenly confirms another theory of his, that Song Yul is not Mr. Hun's biological son. Jung asks how the prince knew about it, but the prince trails off as he mentions that he didn't hear about it directly. Rather, he has noticed how Song Yul never called Mr. Hun his father at all. Prince Ryeok recalls the time when Song Yul asked to join the meeting, where he mentioned that seeing Mr. Hun might give him the courage he needs to tell the prince everything. The prince begins to piece together what he knows about Song Yul. Song Yul never went to school and has not lived a normal life since his childhood, so that would mean that Song Yul has been with Mr. Hun ever since then. Their strange relationship makes Song Yul revert to being a child whenever they meet. Prince Ryeok pulls himself away from his thoughts and asks Jung where Song Yul is. Jung has heard from his colleagues that Song Yul has just left the meeting room. He lingered for a while in the room and talked with Mr. Hun, but Jung didn't know what they talked about. The prince wonders if the listening devices they had placed beforehand got anything, but Jung informs him that the Jodong Pharma delegation must have brought signal jammers with them, so those devices became useless. For villains, Jodong Pharma is actually quite the smart ones. I'll give them that. Frustrated that the recordings are now useless, nothing has been going as planned for the prince. He tries to smoke for a bit, but he stops himself once he realizes that Hun is coming back. Jung wonders if Hun even cares about the prince smoking when Prince Ryeok was smoking a lot when they first met. Embarrassed, the prince points out that their relationship is different now, and Jung simply dismisses the prince's concerns with a comment about him being considerate. Jung suddenly asks the prince why he left Song Yul behind in the room. Jung knows that Song Yul would be scared right now, especially after what Mr. Hun did. The prince recalls Song Yul's determination and knows that Song Yul should be nervous during the meeting. However, Prince Ryeok chooses to believe in Song Yul, that he will be able to go out of the room by himself. He recalls how Song Yul, petite as he is, often shook whenever they talk about Jodong Pharma. However, despite that, he was able to sit through the meeting and take in the pressure of everyone from Jodong Pharma there. He knows that Song Yul himself wants to break free from the shackles that his time in Jodong Pharma has on him so that he can move on. The prince affectionately comments that Song Yul is stronger than he looks and Jung has no choice but to agree with the prince. Jung also comments that he must think highly of and try to flatter Song Yul now, to which the prince casually agrees, a reaction not quite what Jung expects. Prince Ryeok also asks Jung to ask for some clothes from the wardrobe department. Jung asks what the clothes are for, and then he sees Song Yul walking by from the meeting room in his plain clothes. Getting what the prince meant, Jung promptly agrees to do as the prince asks. The prince is surprised that Jung didn't berate him for the request. Jung simply remarks that as an inhabitant of Jungchung Hall, Song Yul has standards that he should meet. Jung also clarifies that he doesn't dislike Song Yul Hun, and Prince Ryeok fondly looks at Song Yul as he points out that he already knows about it. Prince Ryeok is so down bad, and I'm just here to witness him so in love with Song Yul. Wearing a red blush from his crying outburst back in the meeting room, Song Yul brightens up as he sees the prince sitting on a nearby gazebo. Finally getting a closer look at Song Yul, Prince Ryeok notices Song Yul's wet sleeves and his reddening nose that matches an incessant sniffling. The prince understands what Song Yul has been up to back in the room and suddenly springs up from his seat. He points out that his body has been feeling stiff from all his sitting, so he wants to rest. He invites Song Yul to join him at the hot springs, surprising Jung. Jung respectfully mentions that the prince still has a lot of work and he should not be that tired already. As if completely not caring about his workload, Prince Ryeok sweetly points out that he should have already done a lot of it since he woke up early to finish up the urgent ones. He leaves Jung in a tired slump as he assures Jung that he'll finish the rest in a bit. He also asks Jung to send their dinner to the hot springs. Jung is left rotting the potential work he would have to do for the prince. At the hot springs, Song Yul tries to stop the prince from helping him out, but the prince rebuts by saying that Song Yul shouldn't pretend that he is okay. The prince compliments him for doing well in the meeting and invites him to relax in the hot springs with some food. Song Yul finally breaks down at the prince's words and thanks the prince for all his help. Meanwhile, the prince closes his fist in frustration at how helpless he is at truly helping Song Yul out and regrets not having a handkerchief to wipe Song Yul's tears away. Both of them get into the hot springs, but Song Yul shifts awkwardly as he asks the prince if they really should be in the position they are in right now, with the prince hugging Song Yul from behind. Song Yul awkwardly asks the prince if they must be in the position they're in right now, with the prince nestling his face on the nook between Song Yul's neck and shoulder, while affectionately hugging Song Yul from behind. Prince Ryeok notices the blush reddening on Song Yul's face, ears, and shoulders as he asks if Song Yul is uncomfortable with it. Song Yul abruptly looks back to clarify that he isn't uncomfortable, but his lips are immediately captured by the prince's, both now enwrapped in a passionate kiss. Once their lips break apart from each other, the prince trails more kisses on Song Yul's neck and asks Song Yul if he got upset after being left alone at Sumyoung Hall, the meeting room. Song Yul recalls the moment when the prince left the room, inviting Song Yul to leave the room. Song Yul seems preoccupied with other things to be upset with the prince at the time. He didn't even expect himself to be able to ask the questions he had always wanted to ask Mr. Hun, yet he did. Although he still can't bring himself to talk about how he was treated back at Jodong Pharma, he acknowledges the courage Prince Ryeok gave him and his faith in him that he can leave on his own. Song Yul also lets him remember that it was Song Yul who suggested joining the meeting, and he also recalls the responsibility that the prince would bear if the prince got hurt because of Song Yul. He wants the prince to stop worrying about him so much. He can be strong now. Pondering upon Song Yul's words, Prince Ryeok suddenly grabs Song Yul and spins him around to face him. He initially planned on only giving him a few minutes back at the room before giving him an out, but seeing Song Yul walk out on his own and hearing what he just said made him realize how incredible Song Yul is. The prince plants more kisses on Song Yul before catching Song Yul's lips again with his own. After an arduously long day, both men enjoy the comfort and relaxation that the hot springs have afforded them. They both deserve a nice, long bath after that draining meeting with the spawn of the devil that is Mr. Hun. After a while, the prince asks Song Yul if he's fine now, seeing that Song Yul was crying just a while ago. The prince had to bring him to the hot tub thinking that Song Yul was uncomfortable in the spring. Since Song Yul seems awkward after, it seems that only the prince enjoys their time in the hot spring. However, Song Yul clarifies that he also enjoys their time in the hot spring. The prince manages to be so passionate yet so gentle, making Song Yul appreciate the prince's consideration. He recalls that back in the lab, he was subject to similar activities, where they only aimed to provide maximum pleasure. However, this time, Song Yul doesn't seem to hate it, but rather wants it more, because it's with Prince Ryeok, who always affectionately calls him Yul. Prince Ryeok notices Song Yul spacing out and calls him out. The prince then points out that he suddenly becomes a different guy when he spends with Song Yul. Whenever the prince sees Song Yul enjoy normal things, Prince Ryeok feels like he becomes a normal guy with no royal responsibilities. Prince Ryeok presses himself closer to Song Yul's body and Song Yul affectionately looks at the prince behind him. Song Yul realizes that just like how he feels like an ordinary person when he's with the prince also feels the same. The realization fills him with happiness as both of them enjoy the embrace of one another. They have such good communication and good chemistry together, I can't stop reading about them. Suddenly, the prince mentions that he wants Song Yul to come with him to Seoul. There, they will visit Gwanghae Institute. The prince invites Song Yul to come with him to Seoul to visit Gwanghae Institute. The prince reminds him about getting a checkup there since he can't afford to let the people from the institute come to the palace. With way too many eyes inside Yeonhwa Palace, they need to be more discreet about this. Song Yul thinks about it for a while and then asks the prince if the people in the institute are like Jung. The prince does not understand what Song Yul means by that. Song Yul explains that he knows Gwanghae Institute uses Jodong Pharma medicine, so he's afraid that they might be on Jodong Pharma's side. Song Yul then gets afraid that his concerns must have been irrelevant. However, the prince instead pulls him into a kiss on the cheek, pointing out how cute Song Yul is for worrying about him. Prince Ryeok then assures him that his visit to Gwanghae Institute is under the guise that he is filming a campaign video for people to get tested for unique traits. If Song Yul doesn't present major issues, everything should be good to go. The prince has also discussed these matters with the director of the institute. That eases Song Yul's worries about them being on Jodong Pharma's side. Prince Ryeok then leaves the bath, bringing Song Yul in a princess carry. Song Yul tries to stand, but the prince doesn't let him, afraid that Song Yul might stumble and fall. Left to follow the prince's bidding on him, Song Yul chooses to hug the prince around his neck and thank him. He buries his face on the prince's shoulder as he contemplates the many things the prince has done for him all this time. The prince sweetly looks at the boy he's carrying and thanks him back for making him feel like everything is better. A while later, Jung asks for permission to enter the prince's chambers. After being allowed to enter, Jung announces that he has both good and bad news for him. Being in a good mood, the prince wants to hear the bad news first. Jung strikes hard and fast, letting him know that his department will have a budget cut next year and Mr. Hun wants to meet him again. Jung clarifies that Mr. Hun does not want to meet in a public capacity. Rather, it's just a brief meeting before Mr. Hun visits Yudong Hall. The prince knows that this is just a farce for Mr. Hun to send instructions to Song-yul and the fake Song-yul. The prince then asks why they are getting a budget cut. Jung explains that Jodong Pharma is skeptical about his capacity to organize the campaign related to unique traits. They believe that either Guanhe Institute or the Department of National Records may be more well-equipped to manage it. The prince acknowledges that this is under the responsibilities of the Department of National Records, but he is worried that Jodong Pharma is pulling Guanhe Institute among all of this. He anticipates that Mr. Hun has an insider among the Institute's board of directors. Getting frustrated at the roadblocks Jodong Pharma has been putting on his way, Prince Ryok resolves to get the Institute director's support before them. Jung then tries to give the prince the good news to appease his mood as they walk out of the chambers, but Prince Ryok wants to hear about it later. He's afraid that he might just run straight to Yule the moment he hears something about him, making Jung regret even worrying about the prince. The prince and Jung reach the fake Song-yul's quarters, where a courtier greets the prince. When asked about the junkie's condition, the courtier curtly informs the prince that the junkie can barely move and talk. Prince Ryok infers that the junkie must be behaving because of Mr. Hun and lets the courtier leave. Jung asks what the prince wants to do with the junkie. The junkie won't tell them anything, so Jung suggests that they wait until Guanhe Institute gives them evidence to pressure the fake Song-yul. However, the prince interrupts him by saying that it would take too long. The prince knows that he has to act before Mr. Hun since he knows that Mr. Hun would be able to scheme anything, even within the palace walls. He also knows that his attitude during their last meeting didn't quite have the effect he wanted on Mr. Hun, so if he plans to pressure the junkie instead as proof that he is willing to put up a fight. The fake Song-yul's royal chambers open up to show an angry Hun Seok sloppily dressed in bare white clothes. The prince points out that Mr. Hun broke the fake Song-yul's face, so he doesn't deserve to be looked at angrily. Hun Seok aggressively lunges at the prince and the prince proceeds to provoke him by dropping his theories. The prince already knows that Hun Seok is not Song-yul Hun, but the one they know as Cholsu Kim. He has also concluded that both Song-yul and Hun Seok are Mr. Hun's illegitimate children, and Mr. Hun simply manipulated Song-yul since he's easier to take advantage of. Since people didn't know Song-yul existed, they planned to get rid of him as soon as they were done with him. However, Hun Seok exchanged places with Song-yul for his own gain. Hun Seok confirms that he is not Song-yul Hun, but he jeers at the prince for trying to go against Jodong Pharma. Hun Seok also wonders why the prince is talking about Song-yul now and thinks that the prince might love him and plan to use him as a bargaining chip against Jodong Pharma. The prince points out that he doesn't plan to take advantage of Song-yul. Instead, he just wants to get rid of people who exploit innocent people like Song-yul. The prince gets closer to Hun Seok, letting him know that he specifically made time to do just that. He then threatens Hun Seok to spill their secrets while he's asking nicely. An angry Prince Ryok can be quite the sight. 2. Go be angry for your man, Ryok. The prince gets closer to Hun Seok, pointing a finger at him while telling him that he made time for today just to get rid of people like him who mistreat innocent people like Song-yul. Prince Ryok threatens Hun Seok to spill Jodong Pharma's secrets while he's playing nice. Getting infuriated, Hun Seok instead tells the prince to ask the question to Song-yul if he really is that invested in putting them down. Hun Seok then points out that people who think they're good people just because they helped out a pitiful person like Song-yul are hypocrites. The prince is doing this not out of his benevolent heart, but rather because he also gains something once he knows what Song-yul has gone through. Hun Seok knows that the prince has some rivalry with his brother, and the prince must be trying to use this situation to his advantage, holding back a fist forming on his hand. The prince agrees that things will work out in his favor if he ends up knowing what Jodong Pharma has been up to. However, he clarifies that treating someone like a normal human being does not make him a hypocrite. Hun Seok might be projecting himself onto others. Hun Seok's eyes widen in rage, prompting Jung to back off close to the wall to tap some sort of emergency button. However, Hun Seok calms down and thinks out loud about wasting time on the prince. He ends up telling the important details to the prince. He finally introduces himself as Hun Seok Lee, Mr. Hun's illegitimate son. However, Song Yul is not related to Mr. Hun at all. Song Yul was sold by his Omega father to Jodong Pharma for illegal substances. Song Yul Hun, the youngest Omega son of Mr. Hun, never existed but rather made. Jodong Pharma screened many candidates who could take on the role. These candidates who manifested Omega characteristics underwent a series of experiments, and the one who would be left alive after would become Song Yul Hun. When Mr. Hun announced that his supposed youngest son was born in Omega, it was actually an indication that Jodong Pharma had successfully created an Omega test subject. Prince Ryok then points out that Song Yul is an Omega. Hun Seok jeers at the failed Omega that Song Yul became. However, since Mr. Hun has publicized Song Yul Hun so much, using him to further some laws about Omegas, they couldn't take it back anymore. Their experiments on Song Yul continued, this time mostly to satisfy their curiosity. Instead of seeing how they could make a child manifest into an Omega, they turned their goals into making a normal person into an Omega. Both the prince and Jung are stunned at the revelation. Hun Seok continues, pointing out that all companies are greedy for money. An aphrodisiac called Omega Go sells for a lot in the black market, and it's constantly in high demand. That medicine was formulated thanks to the experiments they conducted on Song Yul. The prince clenches his teeth in anger that's about to burst, and Hun Seok clearly enjoys the reaction he has elicited from the prince. Hun Seok informs the prince that if they cancel the marriage, Song Yul will eventually go back to that lab, trapped and experimented forever. Unable to hold back his rage, Prince Ryok finally lunges at Hun Seok, grabbing him by the hem of his clothes. Jung tries to stop the prince, but Hun Seok aggravates the prince further by confirming if Song Yul and the prince have been spending the night together. Song Yul was originally prepared for their VIP clients, but none should be as VIP as the prince himself anyway. Jodong Pharma has no purpose for a used product anymore. At the comment, Prince Ryok's anger finally explodes and squarely lands a punch on Hun Seok. Jung tries to hold the prince back, rationalizing that Hun Seok might be lying to them. However, Prince Ryok screams at Hun Seok for ruining Song Yul's life like that. You know what? Hun Seok deserved that. And all of Jodong Pharma, too. Hun Seok retorts back to the prince, pointing out that the prince is lucky to have been born a prince. Hun Seok didn't want to be born into a poor family, and neither did Song Yul want to be born into a life of needles and experiments. That was simply the truth of it. The answer does not appease the prince one bit, and Prince Ryok kicks Hun Seok on the ground, even throwing Jung off. However, the prince is still fuming with rage as he taunts Hun Seok to get up. The prince throws Hun Seok back, tumbling even Jung, who was trying to stop him. However, the prince seems unstoppable in his fit of rage against Hun Seok. Jung knows that he has to stop the prince before Jodong Pharma uses this situation to their advantage. He grabs the prince by the arm, warning him about Jodong Pharma and the potential lies that Hun Seok might be spewing. Jung calms the prince down by asking him to think rationally, making him understand that Hun Seok is simply making him angry on purpose so that he does something reckless. Jung begs the prince to take a step back and rationally think of a plan for this. The prince finally lets his fist go, but he held it so tight that his nails dug through his hand, dripping blood from it. He then orders Jung to call for the doctor to treat Hun Seok. He also wants to make sure that they have Hun Seok on constant surveillance and have another background check on his real identity. Jung breathes a sigh of relief once he sees the prince calm down. He escorts the prince to his chambers, leaving the battered Hun Seok keeling on the ground. As the two leave the room, Hun Seok snickers, pointing out that the prince is a hypocrite and he can't hope to bring Jodong Pharma down without letting people what truly happened to Song Yul at the lab. He then taunts the prince to let Song Yul speak of his experience personally to everyone. Instead, the prince ignores Hun Seok and leaves the man to his mocking laughter. The prince can only hope that everything Hun Seok revealed to them is not true, but given how Song Yul has acted ever since they met, it's more than likely that everything might be true. The bottle they gave back to Song Yul when they first met was one that has been ruining his life. After being abandoned by his parents, he had to go through so much unspeakable suffering because of greed. After everything he knows, he can't forgive himself for leaving Song Yul alone in the meeting room with those horrible people. He cries in frustration after basically breaking his promise and protecting him by leaving him out to the wolves. Jung simply stays beside the prince in a joint pity. What can you even do once you hear all about the suffering that your loved one has gone through before? I totally understand Prince Ryok's position here. From then on, Prince Ryeok swears never to let anyone else know about what Song Yul had gone through, and he will use everything but Song Yul's experiences to bring Jodong Pharma down. He will have to find another way to take on this fight. The prince asks Jung to call Song Yul to his chambers, and Jung promptly agrees. He then lets Jung leave as he steals his resolve to save Song Yul. He won't let his ignorance and pride hurt Song Yul even more. Song Yul passes by some beautiful textiles hung in a chamber, taking in their beauty as he walks through them. He greets Courtier Yoon once he sees her, who invites him to eat more snacks. Song Yul is grateful for the gesture but declines the offer. Courtier Yoon then points out how beautiful the fabrics are, and Song Yul simply agrees in awe. Courtier Yoon also lets him know that some of these textiles are for Song Yul's new clothes, since the prince has asked them to make new ones for him. She informs him that April is still snow season in the palace, so they want to make something warm for him. Courtier Yoon begins to take Song Yul's body measurements. While Courtier Yoon busies herself with the measurements, Song Yul realizes that April should be the end of Prince Ryeok's engagement. If the prince has planned to prepare something for him by then, that would mean that the prince plans to keep him around even if the engagement is over, right? He begins to hold out hope, especially that the prince has prepared him these beautiful fabrics to be made into his custom-fitted winter clothes. Courtier Yoon suddenly exclaims that the prince is coming their way, so he reminds Song Yul to thank the prince for this. Song Yul sees the prince indeed coming towards them, but his attention gets diverted back to Courtier Yoon, who suddenly asks what he wants to be embroidered into the clothes. Song Yul looks up and sees a willow tree calmly swaying through the wind. He lets her know that he'd like a willow tree on the clothes, but Courtier Yoon points out that the design would be difficult. I'll have to say, I still don't see the relevance of the willow to their story, despite the name. They did enjoy some time together under one, but that's just it. Let me know if you guys figure it out. Nevertheless, she assures him that she can make it and urges Song Yul to approach the prince. She also reminds him not to skip meals while patting his head. Song Yul gets teary-eyed at Courtier Yoon's kind gesture and thanks her before leaving for the prince. As he passes by the garden to the prince, Song Yul is reminded of how lucky he is to be around kind people. He wants to do something in return for their kindness, and he wants to start by thanking the prince. He greets the prince when he is close enough and apologizes for making him wait. However, Song Yul stops in his tracks once he sees something. Song Yul apologizes for taking a while when he abruptly stops as soon as he takes a good look at the prince. He notices the prince smiling sadly while having swollen eyes. The prince teases Song Yul, saying that he should have come earlier. The prince then leads him, with Song Yul following suit. Song Yul can only wonder what happened to the prince that caused his eyes to be swollen. Unable to hold his curiosity back and worried, Song Yul asks the prince if he's okay since he doesn't look fine. However, Song Yul apologizes if ever his concern is out of line. Prince Ryeok assures him that Song Yul could never offend him and hands him his coat. He explains that the weather is too chilly and he can't afford to be sick since they both need to be in Seoul on the weekend. Song Yul readily accepts the coat and notices how good it smells. Suddenly, the prince announces that he came from Yueyang Hall just now. He reveals that he knows the fake Song Yul's real name to be Hun Seok Lee. He explains that he wants Mr. Hun to know that he already knows who the real Song Yul Hun is. The prince sympathetically talks about the horrors Song Yul went through since he was a child in Jodong Pharma. Song Yul is getting nervous at the topic, while Prince Ryeok suddenly exclaims that he would eliminate Jodong Pharma that very instant if Song Yul ever so wishes for it. If Song Yul wants to inflict the same pain he's gone through on them up until now, the prince would help him do that too. He also promises to give Jodong Pharma to Song Yul. Song Yul is overwhelmed while Prince Ryeok continues to explain that since Song Yul is legally Mr. Hun's son, Song Yul would have some money from all the embezzlement Mr. Hun has been doing. Song Yul would particularly have a large amount under his name since Mr. Hun doesn't expect Song Yul to gain access to those funds. However, Song Yul stops the prince from his detailed plans for revenge and lets him know that he has never once thought of exacting revenge against Jodong Pharma. He's not being nice. Rather, he's more content about not having to think about them anymore. More than anything, Song Yul wants to be with the prince, at least until the prince finds someone better. This time, the prince cuts him off upon hearing that Song Yul is expecting him to find someone else, wearing a forlorn look on his face. Song Yul explains that since their engagement arrangement will be terminated soon, the prince should be expected to find someone else to marry. Dejected, the prince realizes what Song Yul means. Song Yul thanks the prince for his help all this time, but Prince Ryeok suddenly stops him again. The prince grabs Song Yul by the shoulders and leans his head toward the other man as he explains that he wouldn't do any of these things if he didn't have feelings for Song Yul. Sang Yul is bewildered while Prince Riyak continues to explain that his feelings started out of curiosity. Who was this person who moved in with his supposed fiancé, and what information can the prince glean about Jodong Pharma from this young man? However, getting to know Sang Yul more, the prince began to think of him more often. He knows that just like him, Sang Yul hasn't exactly lived his life and he has a big secret he has been hiding from him. Sang Yul recalls his experiment specimen number as he confirms that the prince did pity him. The prince feels sorry for Sang Yul for everything that he has gone through. However, he also knows that despite everything, Sang Yul still has an adorable side where he can smile about the most mundane things. The prince cannot just drop everything to be together with Sang Yul, not right now. He holds Sang Yul's arms as he promises that he is seriously considering their relationship. Looking straight at Sang Yul's eyes, he declares that he thinks of Sang Yul as his lover, incredulous. Sang Yul is trying to comprehend the sheer fact that the prince might be his lover, someone who has feelings for him. The prince asks Sang Yul if he also has feelings for the prince, as if a bit too enthusiastically. Sang Yul explains that his feelings for the prince can't be distilled into words, yet he can't imagine the prince harboring the same feelings for him. The prince can't help but grab Sang Yul's hand, planting a sweet kiss on it. The prince then declares that he does have feelings for Sang Yul too. Unable to believe it, Sang Yul can only express his happiness in tears. The prince wipes his tears away, commenting that he can only seem to make Sang Yul cry lately. In between his sobs, Sang Yul explains that he has never had anything to his name for his entire life. The prince has made him happier than he could ever imagine, has given him so much more than he had ever thought of having, and taught him things he had never thought of knowing. Amidst the blooming flowers in the garden, Prince Riyak promises a new beginning for both of them. The prince will grant Sang Yul wings with which he can soar and fly high wherever he wants to go. When the prince heard about what they had done to Sang Yul, he was reminded of himself when people in the palace treated him like a mutant. He gave Hun Siyak a beating for it. Sang Yul captures the prince into a tight embrace, unable to hide his happiness any further. Just like Sang Yul, the prince also hasn't had anything for himself. However, they will now seize what's rightfully theirs and reclaim what the world has taken away from them. In between his tearful cries, Sang Yul finally tells the prince that he loves him. In that same passionate embrace, Prince Riyak also tells Sang Yul that he also loves him. Finally, they tell each other that they love each other. Now, to get past their problems. A young Prince Riyak, age 7, happily approached his father, bringing with him a piece of paper. With a cold stare, his father dismissed the piece of paper from Prince Riyak and brushed it away. The palace had been in a state of unrest ever since the prince with unique traits had been born, and thus his father had no time to spare for him. The young Prince Riyak glumly left his father's chambers, regretting not bringing tea with him. He then thought of bringing tea to his brother, since he knew what tea his brother liked. He happily greeted his older brother, slouched in his chamber. However, as soon as Prince Riyak offered the tea he brewed, his brother immediately slapped Prince Riyak away, throwing the teacup on the ground. Courtiers immediately came to the aid of both princes. Prince Riyak's brother ordered a courtier to get it out of the room. One of the courtiers warned Prince Riyak to be careful around the crown prince since some news came out about the crown prince's succession to the throne. Meanwhile, another courtier tried to clean up the teacup on the ground while Prince Riyak held onto his burnt hand. However, the crown prince clarified that he wanted Prince Riyak out, pointing at him like he was a mere thing. Prince Riyak abruptly wakes up from his nightmare. He catches his breath while wondering why he dreamed about his past again. Prince Riyak does have his own history to tell, and maybe that's why he and Sang Yul have this close bond. In a plane, Sang Yul curiously but uncomfortably looks out the window. Sitting beside him, Prince Riyak asks what was making Sang Yul uneasy. Sang Yul confesses that it is his first time on a plane, so the prince assures him they are unlikely to crash. Right across them, Jung in an eye mask casually lets them know that their bodies would be hard to find if they do crash. The prince berates Jung for making Sang Yul even more uncomfortable and instead asks him to get some snacks for them. While Prince Riyak continues to banter with Jung about making him get their snacks personally in fear of getting poisoned, the prince holds Sang Yul's hand, as if to comfort him. Sang Yul sweetly smiles at the prince's gesture. After their passionate confession to each other, not much has changed in their daily routine. Sang Yul continues to read and do the homework that the prince gives him, leisurely walks in the garden, and gets visited by the prince whenever he can. Sang Yul feels his heart swell with satisfaction at how his life has been going so far. Suddenly, Sang Yul realizes that his body hasn't reacted to this emotion. Back then, his body was so sensitive that even the prince's mere mention of his name elicited a reaction in him. He wonders if it's because he has stopped taking the medication Jiudong Pharma sends him, but he didn't expect it to work right away. Suddenly, the prince exclaims that they are about to reach their destination and encourages Song Yul to change ahead of time to get rid of his nervousness. Although Song Yul assures the prince that he doesn't feel uncomfortable anymore, Prince Ryok teases Song Yul that he will dress him, which Song Yul rejects embarrassingly. The flag of the Republic of Korea waves high as soldiers salute the arrival of the prince and his entourage. Jung reminds Song Yul to avoid fidgeting and looking around. The prince reaches his designated car, where another soldier greets him. Prince Ryok asks him to bring them to Gwanghae Institute, and the soldier immediately makes way for the prince to enter the car. Prince Ryok urges Song Yul to go inside the car first, but Song Yul reminds him that a royal's entourage should get inside the car last. However, the prince dismisses such protocol, assuring him that everyone's too busy to be picky about it, while caressing Song Yul's head. Jung sternly urges the prince to get in the car and asks him to behave himself appropriately. During the ride, Jung reminds the prince to be wary of his actions in public if they want to keep their relationship secret. Prince Ryok wants to announce their relationship publicly, but Jung immediately berates him for the sheer thought of it. Meanwhile, Song Yul blushes as he realizes that people might recognize them as a couple now. Yes, you are now a couple, Song Yul. Hammer it to your head because you deserve it. Amid his reverie, the prince suddenly pinches his cheeks, asking if Song Yul feels comfortable now. The prince also shares that he himself is also nervous. He reveals that he had a nightmare the night before, making him lose a bit of his resolve. He finds himself pathetic after talking big about helping Song Yul during his confession. However, Song Yul grabs the prince's hand and tells him that he could never be pathetic. Without the prince beside him, Song Yul would end up becoming a shaking mess. He declares that he can't fathom being the prince's lover, but before he can continue his passionate speech, the soldier announces that they have reached their destination. Song Yul immediately realizes where they are all this time and blushes in shame. As Song Yul is about to open the car door, the prince grabs his hand and tells him that he won't be with Song Yul for a while. He instructs Song Yul to trail Jung and assures him he'll be fine. The prince sweetly smiles at Song Yul and plants a soft kiss on Song Yul's forehead. Song Yul clasps the prince's hand tighter as he thanks him, while the prince reminds him that he will be joining them soon. Song Yul then follows Jung to a traditional entrance marked with colorful decorations. He braces himself as they enter and disappear into the walls of Gwanghae Institute. A doctor truthfully confesses that Song Yul's condition is complicated. Although they know that Song Yul has been extensively abused by Jiudong Pharma, the prince only wants to check if he is healthy or not. Song Yul lightheartedly asks if his results came out normal. However, to Song Yul's surprise, the doctor reveals that he is not normal. The doctor points to a screen, urging him to look at 3 certain white blots. Males who manifest with these small glands are expected to have unique traits. Song Yul nervously asks if he was able to fully manifest as an Omega. The answer, it seems, is far more complex. In the first place, the doctor would have been sure that Song Yul was an Omega if he only found one. However, in their first scan, they already found 3, and they can see more of those that are about to form. Song Yul clenches his fist anxiously. Jiudong Pharma should have found out about these, and how did he end up with 3 of those glands? I'm not an Omniverse doctor here, but I can tell that's not good. Before the doctor can continue explaining his diagnosis, a knock disturbs them and the prince comes into the room. Song Yul jolts up the bed and asks the doctor to pause his diagnosis, while the prince announces that his filming ended earlier than expected. He asks about Song Yul's tests and the doctor tells him they're almost done. Song Yul is afraid that the prince would have heard the entire diagnosis. Meanwhile, another person informs the prince that Jiudong Pharma has publicized an article, but the prince assures him that with the Department of National Records involved, Jiudong Pharma wouldn't be able to stop their plan. The prince turns his attention back to the doctor and asks about Song Yul's condition. The doctor reveals that Song Yul's organs remain healthy and intact. However, he shows the screen to the prince, explaining that Song Yul has 3 hormone glands instead of the usual one. Although they are not yet done with the tests for unique traits, they expect to invite a foreign specialist since they have not seen anything like this before. The prince wonders if those might just be tumors, but the doctor clarifies that if they were, Song Yul should be in a lot of pain to the point that he should be bedridden. Another researcher then points out that although Song Yul has the hormone glands, he can't seem to get pregnant. He doesn't have a womb that male Omgas should have, together with the hormone glands, perplexing the doctor even more. Lying on the bed, Song Yul seems to know the answers to everyone's questions. To recall what he knows, he anxiously imagines himself back at the lab. Once Song Yul placed himself back at the lab, he suddenly mutters that people were injecting him with various medications. He announces that ever since he was young, Jiudong Pharma has been trying to turn him into an Omega. Song Yul confirms that Jiudong Pharma has been conducting inhumane experiments on him, thinking that he was going to manifest into an Omega. He was supposed to be a lab rat for medicines for people with unique traits. However, when they soon realized that Song Yul was an Omega, they changed their experiments. The doctor asks Song Yul to recall how long they have been experimenting on him. Song Yul finds it hard to focus, so the doctor recommends to call a psychologist. However, Song Yul clarifies that he should be fine imagining being at the lab again. As long as everyone treats him like an object, he should be able to easily recall his memories at the lab. While Song Yul recollects his time back at Jiudong Pharma, the prince can only sit back as he hears the monstrosities that Jiudong Pharma had been doing to Song Yul. He understands that back then, people hated him because he was a freak with unique traits, an alpha. However, Song Yul was just a little boy who wasn't even an Omega. How heartless could they be? Song Yul continues to narrate his experiences when the researcher interrupts him. He reveals that he originally agreed to take on this endeavor because of his personal grudge against Mr. Hun. However, upon hearing what Song Yul has revealed, he realizes that Mr. Hun is a piece of trash of a human. The doctor then summarizes his hypothesis based on what he has learned so far. According to him, Song Yul could have manifested into an Omega before Jiudong Pharma even experimented on him. Song Yul was frequently injected with 2 specific medications designed to highlight unique traits before examinations. Song Yul must have developed these abnormal side effects because of overdosing on these injections before his traits ever matured. Song Yul asks if he is actually an Omega, although the doctor clarifies that he is only hypothesizing for now. The researcher reveals that the government once ordered them to investigate aphrodisiacs in the black market. The composition of those aphrodisiacs is very similar to those Song Yul was frequently injected with. The researcher assumes that Jiudong Pharma conducted those experiments because they want Song Yul's body to emphasize specific Omega characteristics. The researcher looks at the prince and asks him how they will release this information to the public. However, standing by his promise to Song Yul, he declares that he won't use this against Mr. Hun. The prince will instead use Mr. Hun's illegitimate son and sow discord among his children. The doctor and the researcher are both equally surprised to hear that Mr. Hun has an illegitimate son, while the researcher clarifies with the prince if he is going to kick Mr. Hun out of Jiudong Pharma. The prince expects Mr. Hun to have kept stores of the profits from the aphrodisiacs for himself. He knows that rich people are greedy for money. Once Mr. Hun's children know about his secret money stashes and their illegitimate sibling who owns a large part of that stash, they would immediately go against their father. By sowing discord among themselves, Mr. Hun and Jiudong Pharma should crumble from the inside out. Prince Riyak has come up with this plan after seeing his own brother, heir to the crown and all, still coveting more and getting anxious because of it. The researcher asks how they would contribute to the prince's plan. The prince explains that they only need to make a few public appearances and help Song Yul get comfortable with his body. The researcher agrees on the prince's requests and Prince Riyak thanks them for it. The research also announces that they have been making an antidote for those aphrodisiacs, and they will try to see if it would work on Song Yul. Prince Riyak and Song Yul walk out of the room together. The prince asks if Song Yul is fine after those tests, and Song Yul assures him that he's okay. The prince informs him that they will be taking the plane again going back to the palace. Suddenly, a person bumps into the prince and profusely apologizes for the trouble. The person drops the boxes he was bringing while the prince shields Song Yul away from the person, reminding the person to be careful. The man picks up his items but misses one bag. Song Yul picks it up and offers it back to the person. However, Song Yul sees something written on the bag. Song Yul shudders when he sees the writing 9 p.m. on the bag, clearly a message from Mr. Hun himself. Not this again.